Here it is Friday. Up a little bit earlier. I actually woke up very late, but up a little bit earlier than raid. I've eaten and whatnot. And let's get to the supply rolls, just to get a little bit of something in here. Fleets are always in supply, okay? Supply is assessed when you activate a leader. Hey, this is weird. Just a leader? So individual core, which can move sometime, I would assume that they're supposed to be checked as well. But again, the rules are very, very weak. During combat resolution for the defender, and at the end of the combat resolution for the phasing player, discounting sieges. Out of supply, get a marker showing their status at the time supply is checked, and they keep it until their next check. This will give them mandatory attrition when activated. I assume you recheck. It's at the beginning of activation, so yeah. Artillery is unavailable for combat and sieges, and a negative die roll modifier for such. Engineering capabilities are unavailable, and demoralized units can't be rallied. To be in supply, you have to trace a line to an active controlled fortress on national territory, to the capital of the unit's country, which may not be a fortress. Presumably it has to be under your control. I guess it would be occupied if it's not, is kind of the thing. The capital city of an allied minor, if this capital contains an active fortress. The capital city of the major power the minor is allied to. Okay. A besieged fortress cannot be used as a supply link or supply source. Only a number of steps equal to the fortress value are supplied by the fortress. Excess steps will check for attrition either when they're activated or at the end of the active action phase. Possibly both. So this is interesting. A besieged fortress cannot be used as a supply link or a supply source. Only a number of steps. Yeah, so you're going to have difficulty supplying off fortresses. On the other hand, the -4 out of supply combat penalty does not apply to besieged units except when the besieged unit's sortie and at least one sortying step is unsupplied. So see, this is the weird thing. And this has to do with the bold text here. A besieged fortress cannot be used as a supply link. Is the rest modifying that somehow? It doesn't seem so. It cannot be used as a supply link, right? But it's like this, on the other hand, seems to be a response to that, whereas these other things feel like they're other random pieces of fortress supply. That's how I read it, but then when I get to this, on the other hand, following this paragraph, it feels like only the intrinsic fortress points and the supplied steps do not check for attrition and sewer no combat penalty. Okay, so this gets really weird. A besieged fortress cannot be used as a supply link or a supply source. I think this is actually a modifier to that. Only a number of steps equal to the fortress value are supplied by the fortress if it's besieged. Otherwise, it's fine. And again, you really have to parse this out. But the fact that this final statement here, this final sentence, says that there are supplied fortresses or supplied steps, feels like this all has to do with besieging. But again, it's like you have to try to use reason, and it's just not a clear rulebook. And again, there is a replacement for it, but it's, it's essentially a fan rewrite of the rules, trying not to change any rules. Although, the supply links are an allied major or minor unbesieged fortress, a captured and reactivated enemy fortress. Wouldn't that be allied? I don't know. An active controlled fortress in the national territory, a depot as soon as it's flipped to its non-moving side, or a detachment okay? So you can leave a detachment behind and it will serve as a supply conduit. This is similar to War and Peace, which doesn't have depots, but with the addition of depots, which are used in like Empires and Arms. So I don't know. Each major power, although you can't use a core, but you could break a core into detachments. Each major power must have its own supply line. Minor powers can use their own or the supply line of their allied major power. For the major power allied core, which are integrated into an army of another nation, use the supply line of the army marker's nation to check whether the unit is supplied. So armies give you a special capability to supply outside of that army, outside of that nationality. But like a mixed core, well, mixed core together do not. Both of which are possible. The maximum distance between two supply links is 4 movement points. The distance is computed starting from the unit to the source or the link, so going back to supply. Supply line cannot cross an area of influence of an enemy army, even if friendly units or fortresses are present. Armies no longer have a zone of influence when they are in a battle hex. We covered that before. Okay. The area of contact of an enemy, because otherwise they would just cut supply to whoever they're attacking. So it's not really a beware, it's a wow, you know. The game would really look stupid otherwise. The area of contact of an enemy army, even if friendly units or fortresses are present. So you can't supply back through the general direction that the enemy army only advanced. The main contact hex of a leader without an army, the 2 adjacent hexes do not block supply, though they do block retreat. Enemy combat units. And now we have a little dot here. Enemy guerrillas, Cossacks, and depots. Why is it indented? I don't know. Is it not a combat unit? Do we have an official definition of what a combat unit is? Corps, detachment, and some special units like guerrillas and Cossacks. So, you know what? Guerrillas and Cossacks are already covered. Depots are not combat units. Unbesieged enemy fortresses, and then another, for some reason, it just looks like a printing error. Forbidden terrain, hexes in a neutral, minor, or major power. There may be exceptions to that, especially when Poland is in the game. Like the pre-final division Poland. If an engineer unit on its bridge side is adjacent to a river, you can consider that one river hex side as bridged. I guess that reduces the movement point cost. It doesn't. For this, the engineer unit must be in supply and be flipped on its bridge side during the activation segment or a previous segment to give this benefit. Supply units are either static, depots, or mobile, trains. Only a depot can be part of a supply line. A train can be flipped to its depot side at any time during its activation. Feels a little bit like, well, no. No. I was going to say feels a little bit like Desert Fox, but in Desert Fox, the depots are supply sources, and the trucks, the mobile version of them, can extend supply, so no. A depot can be flipped over to its train side when a leader integrates it into its force, either at the beginning or during an activation. During an attrition check, a stack can spend either a depot or a train and benefit from a positive DRM. Only one can be spent per force and per attrition check. A depot in a controlled harbor can be used as a supply source if this harbor is linked to another supply source by sea areas which are not under the exclusive control of enemy fleets. You need the depot, though. And a detachment won't work. Straits do not block supply, but the sea area must not be under exclusive control of enemy fleets. Now we got something weird here. For example, the British crossed the Channel and land in Boulogne. If they place a supply unit in Dover and convert it to a depot, they're supplied because the distance between Boulogne and depot and Dover is 3 movement points. I think that's the cost for the Strait, right? Boulogne and Dover, it looks like it's 2 movement points. No, 1 for the hex. Okay, fair enough. What was our movement point distance? Is it like 4? Four movement points, yeah. So you don't have a lot of depots. You're not going to be running your supply line off depots. That much we can say. There aren't a hell of a lot of them in the game. So you're going to need to create detachments and such stuff. Okay, attrition itself. Guerrillas, engineers, depots, trains, and permanent fortress points never check for supply. They are not counted when computing hex occupation for attrition. Okay. Movement for combat, avoidance, interception, marching to the sound of guns, and retreat after combat do not trigger an attrition check. They are required in the following. A force is out of supply when it's activated. An attrition check takes place before each battle or at the end of movement if no battle took place during movement. Siege resolution does not count as battle. A force is activated for a second time in the current turn. If it's out of supply, it gets a negative DRM applied to the attrition check. There may be more than one attrition check if there's battles. This doesn't seem to imply that an attrition check is made before the battles. Use of extended movement, and during the final attrition phase for demoralized units, out of supply units that were not activated during the current turn, and besieged units. Now we need the sequence of play, which is, whoopsie. Final attrition phase comes after all the activation phases are handled, which makes sense. If you didn't activate the unit and thus trigger an attrition check on its specific turn, and you weren't able to reestablish or establish a supply line, you do have to check for attrition there. Absolutely reasonable. It's performed before combat resolution of the involved force. So you're going to have to remember, if you go into battle, that you already did an attrition check, so you don't have to do another one at the end of your movement, but you may have to do another one at other battles. If a force does not engage in combat, the attrition check is executed at the end of movement in our siege operations. At the instant an attrition check is executed, roll for each hex separately during combined movement and for dropped off units from any kind of force. Armies check for attrition separately on every occasion. The number of movement points used accumulates from the beginning of an activation until the attrition check. The more you move, the more attrition risk increases. So if you drop off a detachment or something, I think it only spends the movement points that it's spent, which probably means you should make the check immediately when that unit stops moving, which was left kind of ambiguous here. The attrition check result depends on the number of steps involved, and the result is the number of step losses. Let's take a look at the attrition table if we can find it. One difficulty. There we go. So, I guess the die roll is coming down this way. And I guess this is the number of strength points. And you get a number, and you might get a requirement to put cav, an asterisk. An asterisk means you roll more dice and all kind of weird shit, like you might take additional losses. And otherwise, it's the number of steps you lose. If you drop off a detachment, if you drop off a single detachment, it will never suffer attrition for it, and it will reduce the size of your force. So you can actually, like, small forces are immune to attrition, which... So this is something in War and Peace. Little forces were not immune to attrition. They were really unlikely to get hit by, well, little French forces were. But like 3 strength points or less could just march on with no risk at all. And that was kind of cool. Because if you could establish a supply source, you could bring your supply line forward and stuff like that. But what it meant was, if you're traveling over a large area without supplies, especially with the French, you would break up into lots of little, well, with the French, you would break up into lots of little units, ignore supply, and just, you know, march across the countryside. It looks like you can do that here. In fact, you know, given that you need die roll modifiers to get you, I'm assuming you're rolling 2 dice yet, 2 dice, to get you to a 13, you're really pretty unlikely. An asterisk says the force loses 1 more step if the die roll is greater than 4, subtracting 1 if the force is in a city or fortress. I mean, your chance of getting hit by attrition is relatively low with small forces. And why don't we look at what the modifiers are? Okay, so there's no bonus. Oh yeah, here we go. At least half strength points are French or Russian gives you a -1. -2 for the French from spring 1794 to winter 1811. Which means those small forces, 3 strength points or less, they're gonna have a -2. You got a 1 in 36 chance, no, a 1 in 72 chance of taking attrition. Yeah. It's not too likely. Okay, let's keep looking. Now, we're about halfway through the rule book. I'm thinking we're going to break this into pieces. Okay, because this is taking a long time to parse through. What did we hit here? We were here. Okay. The attrition... The number of movement points used accumulates. Wait a minute, movement points? They're not. Are they a modifier here? Force to spend 4 movement points or less gives you a reduction as well. Which is kind of weird, but I guess if you're doing your final attrition, you weren't activated, so you would have spent 4 movement points or less. Things like at least 1 desert hex has been crossed. Give a +2. But I don't think they'd give you it if you're sitting in one, which feels a little stupid. And this +4, winter even in desert hexes, at least 1 desert hex has been crossed. I don't know. Like, why are they talking about winter even in desert? It feels like you should take a penalty for sitting in the desert. So maybe the crossed would come for that, but there's other things like mountains and stuff like that that make, maybe a little less sense. I don't know. The attrition check depends on the number of steps involved, and the resulting is a number of step losses. Only activated leader suffers the effects of attrition, and only the number of steps of the activated force. Yeah, not if you're not activated. Doesn't seem to be any rules for that. Terrain penalties apply when the unit has entered this terrain type at least once during the movement segment between 2 battles, for instance. Okay, so if you march up to battle, this is the most interesting. You march to battle, you march over a desert, you take the penalty when you hit battle. If you then march through clear terrain to the next battle, you do not take the penalty. But if you march and end your turn, you would take the penalty. So you take the penalty once for the terrain types you go through, it looks like. But It really appears to be when you enter the terrain type, not like if you're just settled in the desert, which really feels weird to me, but you know, I don't think people are going to be camping out in the desert, and I feel like the other terrain-based thing is mountain, and well, swamp is probably pretty nasty to be in. And I mean, mountain, you can make an argument that stuff's hard to get in there. And again, sitting in Russia, Spain, Portugal, Africa, or Asia gives you a penalty. Or no, crossing it, but not sitting in it. All movement inside national territory. If you made no movement, would you get, you know, it really feels like these should include static units as well when you're doing that final attrition check. We're going to assume that, I think. DRMs, due to the presence of some nationalities, are available when at least half the involved troops belong to those nationalities. The first loss is suffered by the nation which gave the DRM. Okay. Yeah. That's problematic, actually. Oh, look, the Russians give you a bonus, but we're going to have to kill a Russian first. But the reason for that is so that you don't continuously get that advantage. The additional losses are distributed as the owning player wishes, so only the first loss is under any restrictions. A player is not forced to use this DRM if he does not want to lose steps from the nation. Fair enough. And I assume that includes home country and all that. All right, we're going to break here and actually load this up. We are about halfway through the main rule book, getting to the combat rules. We got the whole multiplayer rules in a separate book, but this just takes so much effort to work through these rule books, and I've gotten painfully long on my videos for some reason. Like, I feel like I'm just doing what I do. Like I'm not doing a lot of, you know, my life existence and stuff in this video. But it feels like just going through the rules even is beginning to take longer than it used to. I mentioned it before. Somebody did a complete rewrite of the rules, trying to actually incorporate the errata and clarify stuff that the errata didn't succeed in. And supposedly that's much, much better. I feel like I can get the gist of the game, but I'm making shit up as I go, right? And I'm directly contradicting rules. For example, the way the Constantinople is being handled. This feels like it was written by 3W. I mean, an argument could be made that if you had big enough guns here like they did it by World War I, you could prevent usage of the Bosphorus at all. But I think the intention is that crossing, the control of Constantinople controls the Bosphorus, period, the end. Again, I'm going to use reason as much as I can, but the rules sure state things that are different from common sense. And remember, this is the second printing after all the errata has supposedly been included in. Okay, so remember, the fleets are basically look like leaders, and they're intrinsically linked to their commander. Each fleet or naval squadron is activated separately, but it can aggregate another fleet during its movement by spending one movement point. The aggregated fleet is considered activated, and it can take command of the group if required by the rank rules explained above. Well, there are no rank rules above, unless they're talking about the land movement stuff or generals or something. I don't know. Yeah, it's like, I don't know. Whatever. Each movement point allows a fleet to do the following. Enter or exit a harbor, move to another sea area, enter an enemy blockade box or an enemy harbor, land units in an enemy harbor, enemy occupied or not, aggregate a fleet. This is weird because there's fleets that start stacked together, but and also, what is the difference between a fleet and a naval squadron? Do we have a definition of that difference? We have naval units. We don't have naval squadron listed anywhere. And we don't have fleet listed here. We look here, and we have naval units, fleets. We don't have squadrons. Okay. All right. Right then. And also the phasing player spends movement points to retreat after a naval defeat. If fleets are located in a harbor which is captured by the enemy, they must put out to sea immediately and end movement in a friendly harbor within range of their MF, I'm assuming movement factor. Let's look in the glossary, see what MF says. I don't think it exists, but it might. Yep. Okay. Which is printed on the fleet. Of course, in black. Okay. Enemy interceptions are possible and even automatically successful if there's a blockade in effect. If such a redeployment is not possible, the fleets are destroyed, i.e. if there's no harbor within range. Movement within a sea area. When a fleet enters a sea area, an enemy squadron at sea can attempt to intercept, followed by naval squadrons blockading harbors while obeying the rule above on the three fleet limit at sea. Again, that's not here. By above, they may mean somewhere in the rules previously, because I do remember that 3 fleet limit being stated above. Where was the other above? The rank rules. In an area. If a naval squadron's interception is successful, naval combat occurs immediately and no avoidance is possible for the moving fleets. If a blockading naval squadron, but not fleet, squadron may be multiple fleets together, succeeds in intercepting a moving fleet, it is placed in a sea area, or they may just be the same thing, because if a friendly naval squadron is already at sea, the new naval squadron must obey the stacking limit of 3 fleets per area while combining with the already present naval squadron. All right. So you won't be allowed to intercept with the blockading force above the stacking limit, is what I read here. If this is not possible, the blockading naval squadron may send only a part of its fleets to intercept and fight. Yeah. If the interception succeeds, 1 naval combat occurs. The intercepting player is the attacker. If all interception attempts fail, the moving fleet can continue its movement or attempt to engage in combat a naval squadron belonging to the inactive player. So it can stop and try to attack. The target fleets can attempt to avoid combat. If combat avoidance fails, a naval combat occurs. To initiate a naval combat, the attacker must designate the defending squadron, which can attempt to avoid combat. No avoidance is allowed if the naval squadron is currently blockading a harbor. A squadron cannot avoid an interception. Yeah, it's weird because of the choice of, replacing fleet and squadron back and forth and whatnot. This feels like it's something very specific. I don't know. Avoidance and interception are resolved with 2d6 and are successful on a 10. We only have to remember 10s so far. The die roll is modified by the maneuver factor of the highest ranking fleet performing the interception or avoidance. I think that is this number over to the left. We can go see. It's so odd to have a leader in conjunction. So we look here, maneuver factor, indeed the line traces to that, And what is this other thing? Tactical bonus. So it's going to be kind of like the modifier in Army combat, I guess. Please note, the use of the movement factor is optional. Not using it allows the owning player to conceal whether the fleet is a real one or a decoy. Here's the problem. Nothing has told me I put these guys upside down. But there are, and I'm beginning to feel like maybe I should be, there are decoy fleets. Like that. Let's look and see if maybe I missed something, and if fleets are always supposed to be the fleet counter's front side gives you this. Yeah, there's no statement so far about using the reverse side as your front side, but that seems almost necessary for the decoys to work. Have we seen something up here that I missed? We have not, but I get the feeling the fleets are meant to be face down. But that might make sense at sea, but I'm not sure how much sense it makes at when they're in port. And I'm really tempted that, like, I don't know what the hell's going on with this. We'll see if we get some more information later on. Where were we? But yeah. If avoidance succeeds, the player can move his fleet into a friendly harbor in the same sea area or move his fleet into an adjacent sea area. Afterwards, the phasing player can continue to spend movement points. Each harbor has a blockade box. A fleet must spend 1 movement point to enter such a box. If an enemy fleet is present in the armor, they may choose to initiate combat without having to roll for an interception. Combat occurs outside the coastal batteries. The weirdness has cleared up again. Just seems to take a while for the screen to warm up or something. It's not like it's cold. Okay, exception. If a blockade is already in effect when a fleet enters the box to take over from another fleet, no combat can take place. If the moving fleet is defeated, it must leave the blockade box and be placed in the linked sea area. I think each blockade box is in only a single sea area. See things like Gibraltar there, the dash line is there up near the Copenhagen, the dash line goes around it. So it looks like each sea area is a single thing. It's going to be a special rule for Bosporus and Gibraltar. Bosporus is weird. It looks like it's its own sea area. Gibraltar does not. So it seems odd that there's, but we'll get to it. Where were we? If it is victorious in combat, the blockade takes effect and the losing fleet must withdraw back into its harbor. If the fleet in the harbor does not want to fight, no combat takes place and the blockade takes effect. The blockade will allow automatic interception of fleets leaving the harbor. No trade money is received from that blockaded harbor, and there's no sea supply. Instead of blockading a harbor, a fleet can enter an enemy-occupied harbor, and naval combat is triggered, the defending unit benefiting from a protection of coastal batteries. The movement will cost 2 movement points, 1 for the blockade box and 1 for the harbor. You wouldn't normally pay this to move into like a friendly harbor, so it's kind of a weird situation. And I don't know if you pay it when you're moving into an enemy harbor. If we look here, land units in an enemy harbor. So what do we have? Enter or exit a harbor, move to another sea area, enter an enemy blockade box or an enemy harbor. So there's something really weird here, which is that, like, Yeah, I'm really disturbed by this. I'm really disturbed by this because they seem to contradict one another. Like, the question is, does it only cost 2 if you're attacking enemy units? Because it costs you 1+1 to enter an enemy harbor and land units at the enemy harbor. But if it costs 2 to enter the enemy harbor via the blockade box, my tape is old and not holding up. Okay. Then it would cost 3, so I don't know. A fleet that, and honestly, it feels like you should just be able to enter the blockade box or the harbor for 1 movement point. And that may be what I just do. And just ignore this fucking rule. A fleet that blockades an enemy harbor can still intercept other fleets in the adjacent sea area, but these actions can break the blockade because the fleet will have to move out. Of course, you could leave part of it behind or whatever. Each national or allied fleet can transport 2 combat points. I think that's steps. Plus 1 supply unit or 1 engineer unit or 1 army marker. Plus any number of leaders. If a combat results in step losses, the first eliminated fleets are the fleets transporting no troops. If their number is insufficient to satisfy losses, each subsequent fleet loss implies the loss of its cargo as well. This is going to be kind of weird because that means you'll load your troops on your best ships, and it feels like those, those may not be transports, but they'd be the ships covering the transports then, and probably less involved in the combat, and therefore they should have less effect on the combat. Just thinking aloud about this. To be carried by naval movement, a land unit must already be in a friendly harbor or an island when the fleet enters the harbor or island. Entering islands feels weird. You'll notice that every island, with the exception of a couple of these up, one of these, looks like it has at least 1 port on it. Some islands have multiple ports. Are there like 1 hex islands or something like that don't have ports? Like, this feels really weird again. Okay, let's keep going. When the fleet enters the harbor or island. So somehow fleets are able to enter islands. Yeah, here's a 1 hex island and it has a port. The land unit must disembark before the end of the activation phase. Failing that, the land units are eliminated. I feel like I want to ignore the islands thing, but I also feel like Odense there has to be a port. It just has to be. Gotland isn't even on there. Oddly enough. Certainly was an important Swedish island and port. I have so little faith in this game and its rules. So where are we? If the destination hex is occupied by enemy units, a naval invasion occurs automatically with penalties against the invader, -3 for combat resolution, but these penalties do not apply to any subsequent siege attempts. A naval invasion cannot take place in a hex without either a harbor, city, or an island. Again, I'm really disturbed by this whole island thing, right? Like, is Britain an island? Or do they mean 1 hex islands, of which I know of 1, 2, And that's it, both of which have ports. I mean, maybe there's another one. We don't have a little island off the coast there. I really don't see like one hex islands kicking around to a large extent. And like, does this mean I can land anywhere in Britain? Because it's all island? Yeah. Okay. Let's see if, again, there's nothing that talks about the map in the game, okay? Like most games have something that talks about what the map is. Maybe island is defined. I don't expect it to be. Nope. Yeah. I really don't know what the fuck they're talking about. So it must have a harbor, city, or an island. A harbor is going to have a blockade, right? Each harbor has a blockade box. A city can be invaded without either of those, apparently. A naval invasion may be attempted only by units which have no activation marker. Fleets can start their movement from the same port for a different port, or a different port, picking up ground units during their movement. Okay. Now, remember, the fleets pick up a unit that hasn't moved in a port, is basically what's going to happen, and take it to an eligible place where they can invade, which is really iffy. I feel like you can invade any island, is what they're trying to say. And I will use my knowledge of that word to include Ireland and Britain, you know, and that they can just land there without having to be in a port or a city. Anywhere else, you'd have to land on a port or a city, I guess. If the harbor is a fortress, the naval invasion procedure is followed. Naval combat against coastal batteries. You have to go in and actually fight at least the coastal batteries. The assault units land. According to this, that's going to cost a movement point. Whereas moving into the blockade box or a harbor, either one of those costs 1. And you don't normally have to move into a blockade box, but something here says maybe you do sometimes. Like to deploy against enemy ships, maybe you have to pay. A combat is resolved with the units outside the fortress, and then 2 siege attempts are resolved. Following the second siege attempt, if the fortress is not captured, the assault is repulsed, and the surviving invaders are removed from the map and are brought back into play as reinforcements during the next spring turn. That sounds like they recover. The survivors. The fleets are placed in the sea connected to the invaded harbor. If the invasion is successful, the force is given a first activation marker and the fleets can enter the harbor. There is no explanation of what happens if you attack not a harbor or a harbor that's not a fortress. My feeling is that if there are enemy troops there, you have to fight them with the invasion penalty. The big difference is you don't have to do the naval combat against coastal batteries. You do have to land units. Wait. You can't land units anywhere but an enemy harbor here. I guess it's free if you do it not at a harbor. I mean, you know, it seems obvious you can attack cities or islands without them having a harbor, yet there's no movement point cost for those things. I mean, yeah. Great rules. We see why there's a rewrite. And we're going to use reason here. We're going to say you have to pay that extra movement point to land the units, because obviously it shouldn't be particularly hard to land them at a harbor, because you can always land them away from the harbor. Okay. And fortresses. Okay, let's make sure we got this. Fortresses are the little stars. So cities don't necessarily have a fortress, in which case they wouldn't be sieged. If the invasion, yeah. Bosporus and Gibraltar. Fleets of all nations can cross the Bosporus as long as Turkey is neutral. When Turkey is allied to a side, only fleets from allied countries can cross the Bosporus. If Constantinople is no longer controlled by Turkey but by another major power, the naval movement of major powers enemy to the controlling power are prohibited unless the controlling power grants crossing rights. Looks like Turkey can prevent it anyway. As an exception to the rules above, Turkey can at any moment decide to prohibit crossing the Bosporus by another major power, but this starts a war with that other power. Yeah, it looks to me, the way this is worded is that you cannot cross the Bosporus if Turkey is enemy to you. Fair enough. If Constantinople is no longer controlled by Turkey but by another major power, the naval movement of major powers enemy to the controlling power are prohibited, unless the controlling power grants crossing rights. Why would you grant crossing rights to someone who's enemy to you? Neutral, maybe. So the way it's worded, either Turkey or the owner of Constantinople, which may be the same person, can prevent you no matter what. Great rules. Okay. I think I've had enough. I'm going to go watch some videos. Easy to get sucked into foolish shit. I mean, I just was watching. I tried napping for over an hour, about an hour and a half or so. Slept a teeny bit. It's like 2 a.m. now on Friday morning, and it's fine. But I've just been watching like for over an hour, maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours almost. Just been watching stupid like comedy videos for some reason. I like them, but I just get sucked in and I want to watch one and I want to watch another. And all right, on to naval movement. Let me relight my pipe though. You can get a few puffs out of it. Just like there's interception, there's avoiding combat. If a defending force has been entered by the moving player, it can attempt to escape, providing a leader is present in the hex, or the defenders are Cossacks or guerrillas. You roll 2 dice, you need a 10 or more. Cool, it's the same number. Games that don't do that kind of piss me off. If the leader commands only cav, his combat avoidance check is automatic unless the phasing player has only undemoralized cavalry units. In that case, the player performs a normal combat avoidance check. It's a little weird. Generally, it's if they have more cav, they can cut it off the cav. But whatever. I can see arguments either way. If demoralized units opt to avoid combat, the avoidance check succeeds automatically. So you can keep running away once you're demoralized. Guerrilla in a mountain also automatically avoid combat, as well as forces which can withdraw into a friendly forces. Leader's initiative is a DRM. It is not here, right? Interception is being better. Leader's initiative is just a bonus. Difficult terrain is a bonus. Light cav being present, I assume for the withdrawing player, is a bonus, except for Cossacks. Crossing an unbridged river with engineers or an army is a big penalty. 3. Cossacks or guerrillas alone in a hex have a big +5. Now note, Cossacks don't help your army, but if they're alone, they'll skedaddle. Negative initiative differential with moving leader. So you get a bonus of your leader's initiative, but you get a penalty if the moving leader is better than you. Which is kind of interesting. So if I have like an initiative of 2 and the guy attacking me has a 3, I still get a +1. As opposed to the interception where things are kind of different. And if a cav leader is present, I get a +1. The total DRM ranges from negative to +3. No such limit over here on interception. except for when Cossacks and guerrillas are alone in a hex, because they get a +5. By the way, I think that's alone without a leader. The hex may not be, they can withdraw into an adjacent hex, but the hex cannot be occupied by enemy units, except if an overrun is possible, in which case no movement points are spent for the overrun. The hex may not be within a contact area, even if it contains only friendly units or an unbesieged friendly fortress. So the situation there is, let's say this force is attacking into here. I couldn't retreat here because that little contact marker would indicate a 3-hex zone. And that applies even if I had an ally next to me. And I'm showing this sillily with 2 of the same nation, but I don't want to do all kind of setup. Avoidance movement may not cross an unbridged river unless the unit is an army or stacked with engineers, in which case it can cross a river, but there's a penalty for that. So you have to declare which hex you're trying to retreat into ahead of time, although that's not specified anywhere yet. The hex into which the unit withdraws is not within the area of influence of another enemy army. The moving army only has a contact area for the purpose of the present rule. Yeah. Okay. So, if an enemy army is moving into my space, it generates a contact area. It does not generate a zone of control, is what they're trying to say there. The hex into which the unit withdraws does not contain an unbesieged active enemy fortress. Okay. If the hex contains a friendly fortress, the units can withdraw into the fortress without a check. Which hex? So this is problematic, right? Withdrawal is into an adjacent hex, but I think this is meant to be withdrawing into a friendly fortress in your same hex. It's not spelled out that way, but I think that's what it intends. That's fairly common. If the phasing player still has movement points, he can continue moving. A leader must stop moving if he enters a hex occupied by an enemy unit. Again, right? Direct contradiction, but we can resolve it. We know what they mean. Which may force his opponent to attempt another combat avoidance. If the combat avoidance check fails, or if the combat avoidance is simply not possible, a combat will take place. The player who failed an avoidance check, though, will get a -1 DRM during the first combat round. So I think you have the choice not to try to avoid combat, but here it's very specific. The player who failed the avoidance check gets the -1. The +1 here is not as clear, but I think the intercepting player gets that bonus. Overruns. A leader has to stop movement upon entering a hex occupied by enemy units. Now remember, that's not the case. He has to pause movement. Except if he's able to overrun those units, where he still has to pause. The enemy can withdraw from your hex, and you did not have to stop movement. This can occur when the enemy is outside a fortress and the phasing unit's printed combat value. Units don't have a printed combat value. Is 5 times greater than the enemy's printed combat value. Count only combat points, do not count artillery. Ignore trains as they have no combat effect, do not apply terrain effects. Okay, so here's the key. Let's go back to the units. They don't have a combat value on them. They have a class, ID, a combat modifier, an artillery value, and morale. It's how many steps there are. With, I guess, depots counting as a half step, but we're not sure about that. So, yeah, weird. If this is the case, the defender is destroyed and the moving leader can continue his movement after having expended 1 additional movement point. Now, I think overrunning depots may not cost anything. I know overrunning engineers and such doesn't. We already hit this rule. I don't know how to find it. I will probably have to look it up at some point. If the overrunning units don't have enough movement points, though, the movement ends. So they're able to do the overrun without a combat table roll, but they don't get to move any further, is how I read that, which is weird, again. Even if the overrunning force spends its last movement point entering the overrun hex, the enemy units are destroyed anyhow. Destroyed enemy leaders are put back in their leader pool. Don't have to make a leader loss check or anything, it seems. Corps markers, army markers, detachments, depots, engineers, etc. are destroyed and put back into their owner's pool. They can be rebuilt. Yep. Now we have here Napoleon's Grand Army spends 3 movement points and then enters a hex occupied by an Austrian corps plus 1 movement point. I don't remember there being a cost to entering an enemy hex. Is this the overrun? No, it seems like the overrun is accounted for here. 6 minus 4 minus 1 equals 1. Let's look at the terrain effects chart and see if entering an enemy hex has a cost. It does not appear to. I think this example is just wrong. That this plus 1 movement point here is incorrect. I've seen no examples, I've seen no other indication that you have to pay a movement point to enter an enemy hex. And it's not in the terrain effects chart. But this would tend to indicate that you do. I know these rules suck, though, so I don't trust them. Force march. This is a land movement, basic or extended, where the units have already moved once during the season. It's executed exactly as above, but an attrition check is required. See 7.0. I don't know if you do extended movement with that, if you do 2 attrition checks, if you have a modifier, whatever. Special terrain. Fortresses. They have a value of 1 to 3. A force must stop its movement upon entering an enemy fortress hex, except if it can drop off a screening force to besiege the fortress. The number of steps of the dropped O screening force must be greater than or equal to the fortress value, while still obeying stacking limits. Put a siege 0 marker. We didn't paw through these, but I have Siege 0 on the back of Fortress removed, Siege 1, Siege 2, Siege 3, and then I think Fortress destroyed? No, Siege 4. Fortress removed is the one. We also have these Fortress -1s and -2s to deal with. Exception. A level 3 fortress can be besieged or screened only by a full army. Well, only by an army. Doesn't have to be full of anything. Now, an army need not have enough steps to besiege it. I'm assuming that it has to meet both of these. You can't send like a 2-step army in. The screening units can perform only 1 siege attempt after activation of the main force. A fortress can give shelter to an unlimited number of steps, but only a number of steps equal to the fortress's value will be supplied. The excess steps will incur an attrition check during the final attrition check. To besiege a fortress, the fortress hex may not contain any combat units friendly to the fortress outside the fortress, i.e. you have to clear them away. When a force enters a fortress hex with enemy units, these units must decide to stay in the open and fight a battle, withdraw inside the fortress automatically, or avoid combat by withdrawing into an adjacent hex which requires an avoidance check. This seems very clear. You can withdraw automatically to a fortress in your hex, not to an adjacent one. So that the hex referred to back here is the hex that you're in, again, in conformance with most games of this type. But so wonderfully written. Some forces can withdraw into the forces while others attempt to avoid combat. If this combat avoidance fails, they can no longer opt to withdraw into their fortress. I assume also you could withdraw like a garrison into the fortress and leave a large force outside to fight the battle if you wanted, if you wish. Although that's not specified. Rivers can be crossed at no cost where the bridge is printed. On the other hand, to cross a river without a bridge, the force must spend 2 extra movement points, except if it's supported by engineers, in which case it's only 1. The presence of engineers reduce the combat penalty for crossing an unbridged river from -3 without engineers to -1 with engineers, which is the same as if there's a bridge. Armies have an intrinsic and permanent engineering unit. If an engineer unit on its bridge side is adjacent to a river, the player can consider that there is a bridge on one hex side. The engineer unit must be in supply and may not have moved during the activation segment in which it is flipped in order to give this benefit. When flipping the engineer unit, point the arrow towards the hex side, which will benefit from the pontoon bridge. Oh, this is not too complicated. We have a bridge here with an engineer on the other side, the engineer being the mobile side, the bridge being the immobile side, and there should be an arrow on the bridge. There is. It looks like it's facing that way, just to be complicated. At the beginning of the activation, the engineer unit must be stacked with a leader to perform this operation. What's not, I think the engineer/bridge counter remains in the hex that it was in, that it moved into. But it projects a bridge across, is kind of how I'm looking at it, which is important because the engineer can be captured or destroyed. The leader activates, flip his engineer unit to its pontoon and cross the river with his corps at no cost. Leaving the engineers who will have to wait for another leader to pick them up. Straits. Crossing straits are forbidden if an enemy fleet is present in the sea area corresponding to the strait. Otherwise, crossing a strait costs 2 additional movement points. Note, seas are areas, they don't have hexes or whatever in them. They had hexes, I think in War and Peace, certainly in Third Reich, which causes all kind of weirdness, like areas work really well at sea. Areas work really well across the board, but we won't talk too much about that. Mountain passes. The movement point benefit of a mountain pass is available only if the pass is following the drawing on the map. So passes show you, which hex sides they can go into. Now, what is their benefit? Their benefit is that they cost 2 movement points instead of 4 to enter. And then they don't have an exit cross cost as well. They just cost you. You pay as if you're in the mountains otherwise. Entering a mountain costs 4 movement points. Crossing a mountain hex side costs another 2. What is a mountain hex side? This is an interesting question, right? Let's take a look. We have mountain. So if we look at mountains, this appears to be a mountain. This also appears to be a mountain. They're colored differently. Is there any reason for this? Not that I can see when I look at this situation. What is a mountain hex side? That's a good question. I don't think this has been addressed Let's take a look at map. You know, first of all, let's look at definitions. Mountain is not in there. Let's look at what there is. The map does not have its own rules. I don't know. Let's take a look at their example here. Example, from 4227 to 4228. Okay, the map ends at 3744. We have an east and a west map numbered differently. That's wonderful. Or do we? Yeah, we do. Well, I thought this was the, yeah, this is where the two maps overlap. This one goes 41, 42, 01, I guess covering that. Okay, 42, 27 to 42, 28. That looks like I'm just entering a mountain hex, not by the pass, right? Although they kind of point the pass at the corner of the two, which sucks. 4 movement points, entering a mountain. From 0128 to 4228. Yeah, that doesn't sound possible. 0128 to 4228. That's going to be entering by pass. That'll cost 2. From 4228 to 0129. That should cost 2. But they say 4. Oh no, to 0129, hold on. From here to here. They say that costs 4. That's entering, so this is weird, right? I'm entering a mountain hex which costs 4. I'm also exiting a mountain. It should cost 6 by my count, right? And I'm crossing a mountain hex side. So no matter how you count it, that should count 6 by my count. But they say 4. From 4228 to 4227. 4228 to 4227. They say 2 and 1. This is not how I would count. Oh, yeah, let's see how they. 4228 to 4227. 1 plus 2 movement points. Now, that would imply it costs 1 to enter here. We know it costs 2 to enter here. But here, I'm leaving this to go here. 4228 to 4227, to me, should cost the exiting a mountain. I feel like this example does not help at all. Like, it's giving me answers that I cannot reconcile with the rules at all. From 3535 to 3534. And we don't know which 35 this is going to be. 35, this is going to be over here somewhere. 3535 to 3534. That's crossing a mountain hex side. That seems pretty clear to me. 1 plus 2. 1 to enter here plus 2. So what it's beginning to look like is that this is not a mountain hex side because it's between 2 mountains. Ugh. Good Lord. Good Lord. They do not, they could have made a separate line in here for mountain hex sides, which indicated that it's these kind of things only, not hex sides covered by mountains. But I think that's what it's looking at now. Some of these other things, though, for example, the ability to move from here to here for 1 movement point does not seem to fit because there's this exit or cross cost is plus 2. But that doesn't seem to apply if you're going from mountain to mountain. But again, that's so clearly wrong in the example that I don't know if I trust the mountain to mountain either. Although you're not going to have many movement points for that. The next one is 3634 to 3534. 3634 to 3534 is through the mountain pass, and that'll just cost 2, and mountain passes costs 2. If you're entering a mountain pass, oddly, if you're entering a clear hex through a mountain pass, it seems to cost 2. Good God, right? Like, if I'm here to here, it costs 1. Somehow from here to here costs 1 as well, even though it looks like this pass is heading here. But maybe it's meant to hit both of them. I don't know. Like, maybe they didn't want to make something that looks absolutely obscene like an X, and they're pointing at the corner on purpose, and that's what they're attempting to show. I'm going to guess that's what it is, because then the example makes sense. But, wow, they really need to describe the map better, right? Okay. Just a few more. Some parts of the map are off-map boxes. Over there, like Caucasus, Georgia, Don, Cyrenaica, Tripolitania. Let's talk about those. Entering an off-map box costs 3 movement points. Exiting the box is not allowed before the next turn. I guess if you have an activation marker and you're in the box, you can't move again. And the cost is 2 movement points in addition to the exit hex cost. So it's going to, no matter what, cost you at least 3 movement points to leave. Units from opposing sides can be present in the same off-map box, but in this case combat is mandatory. Combats are allowed in an off-map box, good, because it's mandatory. Retreats are executed through the entry hexes of the box. Combat avoidance and interception are possible, both from and to an off-map box treated as difficult terrain. Marching to the sound of guns is not allowed between the map and the off-map box. Attrition and supply rules are in effect on them. For supply, a supply link must be present in the box to build a supply chain. French, Russian, Portuguese, and Spanish militia units cannot leave the national territory of their respective national powers. British militia can be deployed in Britain, Gibraltar, Malta, or in foreign wars. Danish, Prussian, and Swedish fleets cannot leave the Baltic Sea and Kattegat, or Skagerrak, whatever. Oh, we do have a divide up there. Okay. I didn't see a division at first. Russian fleets cannot leave the Baltic Sea, the Kattegat, and the Black Sea, except for one fleet which can sail anywhere, which makes sense because they held Corfu at one point during this. All right, that's the end of that. And we're going to pause because we need to charge the battery and I need to read some more and then play some Raid. And the glow is back. All right, land movement. Units can move only when commanded by a leader. Huh? What? Exceptions. Cossacks, Turkish feudal units, and guerrillas, which have sort of an attached leader with initiative, whatever. Detachments and corps can move on their own, but with a provisional initiative of 1. In addition, they cannot enter a hex adjacent to an enemy combat unit or a hex with an active enemy fortress unless the fortress is already besieged by units friendly to the corps detachment. So, no. Right? Everything can move. Engineer units and supply units, though, need a leader to move. Leaders can move without units with 8 movement points. They can use extended march and forced march with no attrition checks, and they don't get activations either. Units spend movement points simultaneously with the leaders to which they're assigned in the following cases. The number of movement points spent to enter a hex is printed on the terrain effects. Integrate corps into an army costs 1 movement point, except if the corps was assigned to an army at the beginning of the activation, which costs at least 1, but up to 2 if it costs 2 to move into the hex, and then they talk about that. Absorb, okay, what? So we've got a dot here. These dots are aligned on this, and then this comes out here. I don't know. Absorb a detachment or a corps steps into a force costs +1 movement point for the moving force. That absorption didn't cost. It does. Okay. Now, my understanding is you can't integrate or absorb if you don't have those movement points. So then you can't enter the hex without causing an overstacking situation, which of course destroys stuff. What is this? Counter? Oh, looks like a little tiny piece of paper. Note that the activation level of the force is not modified by the absorption. Integrated depot, train or engineer unit into a force is free. Aggregate armies together is +2 per hex. I don't even know what that means. There was another cost for integrating armies. Which is not by hex, but I guess it's multiple armies in the same hex can be integrated. But yeah, I don't know. It just costs 2. Overrun combat costs a movement point. River crossing costs 2, or 1 if engineers are present. Let's take a look at the terrain effects chart. You would expect that would be in there. There we go. River +2, +1 with engineers, 0 with pontoons. Bridge is going to cost 0 as well, but it has a penalty in combat. Okay. Straits have a cost. I mean, look. Okay. we won't spend time arguing about this. Rally from demoralization after a battle costs 3 movement points. Army groups. As long as stacking rules are observed, an army group, in army groups, or in lone army, can aggregate or integrate other armies during movement for 2 additional movement points, or armies can start their movement together, and some of them can be dropped off during movement. I don't think you aggregate if you're already aggregated. Although this term aggregation is essentially integration, or is covered within integration. It's just been introduced in this rule. Activation levels must be updated in such moves. We have an example, no problem. Armies, even in an army group, check attrition separately. Armies belonging to an army group can avoid, intercept, march to the sound of guns separately or together, up to the player's choice. When an army group, I would say by the player's choice instead, but that's just a little bit of language. When an army group checks for demoralization during combat, there's only 1 roll for the army group, not for each army. This is weird. Oh, okay, so demoralization is per army group, attrition is per army. For rally tests, each army of the group must roll alone, which is weird because you've got like 1 demoralization marker from the check, but now each army is separate. Yeah. You see that this is going to cause, some issues. It's not a contradiction, it's just an annoyance. Types of land movement. When a leader is activated, he spends movement points to enter adjacent hexes. The activation of 1 leader must be complete before another. Yeah. Movement operations always follow this sequence: normal or extended movement, interception, combat avoidance, overrun. Ooh, I mean, I'm assuming you get to intercept during normal or extended movement. You get to avoid in the course, but I think on a per hex basis, this is what they're talking about. A leader can drop off units in his path or create detachments at no movement point cost, providing stacking rules are observed. Once created, the detachment stays in its hex until the next operation segment. The way you'd handle that is by marking it with an activation level. And that may be why there's so many activation levels, is because all of the individual corps are going to have to pick those up. A leader commanding a force can absorb or integrate units in his path by spending 1 movement point per aggregated hex, provided the rank and stacking rules are obeyed. Likewise, a corps or detachment may merge with another unit, corps or army. Merge, another term, right? We have absorb or integrate here by spending, and now we have merge by spending 1. Okay, I think the difference here is a leader commanding a force versus a corps or detachment. I think they could have shortened this by saying a leader and then parentheses or corps or detachment and parentheses, so they get rid of a couple of lines there. When units, it's just repeating something a little bit, and I don't think there's a significant difference because of the likewise. When units are absorbed or integrated by another force, the leaders that were in command are put back into the leader pool, or they are assigned to the army up to the limit of 4 leaders per army, or they are assigned to a force led by a 3-star leader, 1 subordinate maximum. If units are in the same hex at the beginning of their activation, they can swap combat points at no movement point cost, provided they belong to the same. This is weird. So this seems to allow a weird sort of absorption, provided they belong to the same nation or they belong to minor powers aligned to that major power, provided Rule 5.1.52 is obeyed, and provided the units are exactly the same type. 5.1.52. What the fuck is that? Yeah, so if you start together, you can absorb for free. First time we've heard of this. This is a little weird, but okay. 2 major powers may not swap combat points even if allied. A leader commanding an army can integrate forces within the limits of his command capacity by spending 1 movement point per hex, not per unit. Yes. And now, they don't go to integration. For example, if 2 corps in the same hex are absorbed at the same time, the army commander spends only 1 movement point. This seems to actually handle the integration at distance question that I raised, and that I interpreted it correctly. But this is really weird because, like, absorption is not integration. All these absorption or integration operations can occur anytime during movement operations. No movement point is spent for combat avoidance, retreat, interception, or naval transport landing, etc. Thanks for the etc. You know, I mean, that's just weird, but again, this rule set requires a lot of common sense and interpretation. A leader ends his movement when he's spent his entire movement allowance or the entire movement factor of the units stacked with him, or he has lost a battle of any size. If he still has movement points remaining, he may continue his movement without units only if commanding a corps or a detachment, i.e. you can't leave your army behind, which was already handled. And here it is, a leader commanding an army cannot leave it. We get to an example which I'm not going to read because everything seems to make sense. A leader must stop moving if he enters a hex occupied by an enemy unit or an unbesieged enemy fortress. I don't think that's true. I think a leader must pause moving. Because there's this whole he has lost a battle of any size. But we'll see how combat works. It might be combat is done in another sequence. But certainly overruns you wouldn't have to stop movement for, right? Exception, if the hex is solely occupied by a trainer or an engineer unit in any mode, the unit has no influence on the movement. The lone enemy unit is destroyed at no movement point cost. Okay. But I suspect there's a different kind of overrun, right? One in which you're allowed to keep moving and you fight an actual unit. The moving player must indicate with a specific marker through which hex side the leader entered the hex. We have... We'll get to this in a moment. This hex side and the two adjacent hex sides will usually not be available to the defending player if forced to retreat. If the defending player has no other choice, though, he suffers severe penalties. These three hexes constitute the contact area of the active players. No combat avoidance is allowed through these hexes, even if occupied by a friendly unit or an unbesieged fortress. And I'm going to give you... We have a counter for this somewhere. There it is, the contact counter, which has a little arrow on it pointing towards the bottom of the counter, actually. But yeah, that'll show you what hex side you cross to get into the enemy hex. Extended land movement. Now here we are in something weird. 5.2.3.1. Okay, fair enough. I was looking to see, because this is talking about all kind of other stuff, but yeah, sure. Units and leaders can increase their movement factor by half if during movement they do not move adjacent to an enemy combat unit or enter an unbesieged enemy fortress, and if they never execute an action other than movement, absorption, integration, and dropping O of units. I think that should be just off. An attrition check is mandatory at the end of movement, even if this is the first movement for this force during the turn. This is bold. I think this is extended land movement. It requires an attrition check. That you don't need an attrition check off after every kind of movement. The way things are organized and presented, it almost feels like this is just jumping out of that, but I think it's part of it. Interception. Interception is available only to forces commanded by a leader. Demoralized units cannot intercept. The interception zone of a leader is all 6 adjacent hexes, except when there is an unbridged river between the leader and the adjacent hex. And then we go to exception. A unit with engineers or an army with intrinsic engineers may attempt interception across an unbridged river, but with a -3 penalty. So we have an exception to the exception. As soon as the phasing enemy leader enters the interception zone, the friendly leader can attempt to intercept by moving his force in whole or part into the interception hex, triggering a battle with a +1 die roll bonus for combat resolution during the first round. Who gets that +1? We don't know. I could see it argued either way, because you had to march to get into place and block the enemy, but you're also forcing the enemy to attack you, so you might have an advantage. So we shall see. The moving player is still considered the attacker, so I think the attacker gets that +1 die roll bonus. But do we have a combat table? We should. Let's see if that's a bonus for the attacker, because it's really not clear, you know, who that's a bonus for. Combat results table. Okay, the interesting thing here is that both sides roll for how much damage they do. The L is a leader loss check. The C is a cav special thing. Yeah. And let's see. Interception gives a +1. To who? I'm guessing to the interceptor, how it's written, but again, because they say trigger, I don't know. I don't know, but I think it's the interceptor. Interception's a 10 or more on 2d6 with DRMs, like Cav. Is that if you have any? A Cav leader gives you +1. If the movement point cost of the hex is 2 or more, it gives you a -1. Unbridged river, when interception attempted, gives you a -3 if you have engineers or an army. Initiative of intercepting units is greater than initiative of phasing leader, +1. Initiative of intercepting units lower, -1. At least 2 major power units are involved in the interception, i.e. So I think this would include minors associated with that major. But again, strictly worded, that's not the case. So for example, let's say Sweden's a Russian minor. If Prussia and Sweden intercepted, would they be affected by that? I don't know. I would say yes, because there's a coordination issue there. But again, as written, no. If an army succeeds in intercepting the moving force, at least 1 corps must be sent into the hex the phasing units entered. Again, involved. I assume they attempt to intercept, but again, this at least 1 corps must be sent is sort of different. The interception hex can be occupied by friendly units or occupied by enemy units. I mean, it's really an edge case. So if friendly units are present and the intercepting units integrate or absorb them, remember to adjust the activation and demoralization level. So when you intercept into friendly units to reinforce them, you have to apply stacking, you have to deal with all the integration and absorption. Several leaders may be eligible to intercept the phasing units. The intercepting player must designate in succession which leaders will attempt. As soon as one is successful, all subsequent attempts are canceled. So you don't get like flows of reinforcements coming in or anything from that. Obviously, only 1 force can intercept. Other forces will have to march to the sound of the guns, which is how you get that reinforcement. All right, we're gonna swap batteries so I can keep going. It is Thursday, a beautiful day, and the last day that I could have gone shopping before at least midweek next week, because it's gonna rain on Sunday and Monday, I think. On the other hand, although I got up in time and could have done it, I did manage to talk to my father, which got to see him for the first time since he's been in the hospital, and he doesn't look good. Okay. Oh yeah, and we have a new pope, and it's not me, damn it. Okay. Let's look at the activations. We'll do a little bit of this, then maybe I sit outside, because the glow is back. And massaging my screen doesn't really help, so we'll just cope with it. I know you can't see it. During the activations phase, each player in turn randomly draws a marker from the initiative pool. If it's a naval marker, the involved size executes a naval move. Okay. If it's a neutral land marker, units from the neutral major powers only are activated. This will be their only activation they get, and that means they can't force march, but they're not at war, so that makes sense. A neutral major power is played by one of the sides as explained in their diplomacy rules. Neutral major powers, even if played by a physical player, can move only under 1 neutral activation check. Makes sense. And this is actually a really good solution. So in Empires in Arms or War and Peace, you're allowed to move as if it's a military situation. Now, the truth of the matter is you're probably not going to force march or anything like that unless you're mobilizing. And honestly, mobilizing at a time of neutrality kind of makes some sense that you might rush things, so I don't know. If a land marker is drawn, the leaders belong to the involved side whose initiative value is greater than or equal to the marker can be activated. Now, what it doesn't go into here is what it went into a little while ago, and I understand the desire not to repeat things, but there should be a reference at least to that, which is this whole shit about the same side not being able to be activated twice in a row. Now, it's really weird because the use of the initiative pool is over here. Then we go to stacking and rank. I don't know why the I don't know. And then we go to the actual activations, which is when you use the initiative pool. Anyway. At the end of this activation, a first activation marker is placed on the leader or leader counter on the leader, or the leader counter is flipped if he has no army command. Okay, so this is interesting. So we have these, which show first an activation over. The first activation gets put on top of the army commanders, even though the armies can represent that by flipping them over as well. They won't be the top unit in the stack, so this is actually pretty helpful. And given the huge number of those, I might actually just use those for core commanders. And remember, some of the core commanders can't flip over because then they turn into army leaders. Yeah, for armies, flip the army counter. Yeah, okay. But I think the huge quantity of first activations will be very helpful. If later during the turn another marker is drawn with a value which allows the leader to be activated a second time. Now this is important. Remember, the initiative value has to be greater than or equal to the marker. Initiative is, I believe, the first number. This is how we work through things, right? Initiative is indeed that first number there. So, you know, this guy can only be activated twice in a turn. This guy will have 3 options. Somebody like Napoleon with a 4 initiative is going to have many, many different options. But they can still only be activated twice. It's just they have more flexibility as to when they get to. Or even a third time through an event, this leader can be activated, but his move will be a forceful march, which results in an attrition check. The first activation marker is flipped to the end of activation side, or an end of activation marker is put on the leader. And initiative 1 can never force march. No force can be activated twice in the same activation round. Okay, we have to worry about this because here it says, or even a third time through an event, which may allow, there may be events that allow for something special. When a force has completed its own movement in an activation round, it cannot be moved further in the same activation round, even if integrated, but not if absorbed. Now, we haven't talked about those things. Integration and absorption will be handled over here. A force that integrated a force which had previously activated in the same action round cannot move further. If you join a force which has already conducted siege activity against a fortress in the same action round, you wouldn't be able to integrate it and do further siege attacks. And I'm trying to remember, integration, I think, is you put the core into the force. Absorption is you put strength points from core or detachments into other core. A force which is integrated as a result of march to the sound of guns and which is not previously activated in the same action round could continue to move after the battle with the combined force. A force which has not yet been activated in the same round can be integrated and moved, but no unit can exceed its movement allowance. A leader without, and this all sounds confusing because these concepts haven't been struck yet. It would be useful, I think, if they had gone into these instead of jumping into this multi-activation, but it's complicated because there's an intertwining, a spaghetti nature to it all. A leader without units can move each time an initiative marker allows it. It never gets an activation marker, and it could integrate some units, and then it would be available for activation again and get a marker. Absorption. Absorption only ever affects combat units. It means that the combat unit and one force are dissolved, or that combat units, not all of them. Their combat steps being distributed among reduced core of another absorbing force to replenish those core to full strength. All absorbed units are returned to the owning player's force pool so they can be rebuilt. A moving force can absorb another force or part of a force during movement or when it ends a move. It can absorb itself into another force when it ends its move. Obviously, it couldn't keep moving if it was completely absorbed. A lower ranked leader cannot absorb the force of a higher ranked. It costs a movement point to absorb any number of steps in a single hex. Absorbed core do not contaminate the new force with higher activation level or demoralization as opposed to integration, which means you can march units forward, reinforce through absorption, and then you've got a fully functional, capable of moving force. This feels a little too coordinated to me, but we'll see. This is different from integration. There's never any payment for artillery points. In this case, unlike when core are replenished in the budget phase, which means sometimes the reduced side doesn't have artillery. A detachment or whatever could be absorbed into it, and they get magical artillery they don't have to pay for. Absorption may be used in combination with integration, so the force absorbs some units in another force and integrates some others. If all units, and then it'll pay the penalties for each. If all units stacked with a leader, although what's not clear is there's movement point costs for each, I don't think they'd be cumulative. It just doesn't feel right, but that's just me guessing. If all units stacked with a leader are absorbed or eliminated, eliminated, the leader may be placed in the leader pool or can remain with the absorbing force. As per stacking limitations, absorption limitations. Steps from a major country and from allied minor countries can be absorbed into forces from the allied major power and allied minor powers, provided the combat units belong to the same production type. We got this weird accent over here on belong. I don't know. Just assume that's a weirdness. It looks like it's intended to be an accent, like they put the wrong character in. Guards, grenadiers, guerrilla, guard cavalry, and Cossacks can never absorb or be absorbed. Combat units may only absorb or be absorbed by other combat units if the combat modifiers of both units differ at most by 1 point. Combat units may only absorb or be absorbed by other combat units. Yes, yes. So if a +2 unit can't absorb a 0 unit, of course guards can't absorb, so. And grenadiers can't absorb. So I think that's actually, I know what it is. +1 good infantry. There may be +2 good infantry as well. Won't be able to absorb like militia, which are -1s. So that's an issue. The units must be of the same nationality except for units from major powers and their controlled allied minor powers that can be absorbed into each other. This is an interesting facet. In Empires in Arms, there's a rule which requires proportional law, an optional rule, which requires proportional losses among different nationalities. And I always argued that it wouldn't make sense for that to apply, that shouldn't be used in application to controlled minor powers. And this game seems to take that same view, saying that basically, the controlled minors can be absorbed into the regular core. Because my understanding of the Napoleonic era is that you had this kind of usage, essentially, where you'd have like, Württembergers being incorporated into a French corps, and not necessarily replacing it, like they wouldn't replace at the regimental level, right? Like you wouldn't be incorporating Württembergers into a French regiment. They'd speak different languages. That wouldn't work well. But you would like incorporate a Württemberg regiment into a French corps. And that is not generally allowed in Empires and Arms at all. But in addition, you can't even kind of deal with it by losing those weaker units. It may, in Empires and Arms, it makes, if you play with that option, it makes creating minor countries really, really a negative factor. And my feeling with it is you should do proportional losses amongst the different major powers and their allies, but not amongst minors controlled by a major power, which would come close to what this is. Anyway, you still wouldn't be able to like just absorb strength points from the Württemberg Corps though, which again, history says you could. But at least it puts, anyway. Integration. Integration means that units and leaders of one stack are incorporated into another stack, becoming part of that other stack for all purposes. This can include only leaders and support units, but usually involves two forces with or without support units and leaders. The strength of all combat units in an integrated force is kept as it is. Integration may also occur in automatic consolidations, and stacking limits are always in effect after integration. Must also occur in automatic consolidations. A moving stack can integrate another stack during movement or when it ends its move. It can also integrate itself into another stack when it ends its move. An integrated force may contaminate the receiving force with higher activation levels and demoralization. Leaders and support units on their own have no such activation level, and they're exempted from this rule, but they do gain. So the force has an activation level. So if you're integrating a leader or a support unit, it's not going to contaminate. But I think a leader taking over a stack keeps that stack's activation and demoralization qualities. Again, not spelled out particularly well, but integration may be used in combination with absorption, so that the stack integrates some units and absorbs some others. Legal cases of integration. A core level force may be integrated by an army or another core level force at the cost of one movement point. Armies may be integrated by other armies at a cost of 2 movement points, forming an army group, which now can operate together without disbanding either army. Support units and leaders may be integrated by a moving stack, or a leader may integrate himself and any support units moved by him into a stack when he ends his move. Both of these cases cost no movement points. And this is a better description than the activation level and demoralization case. Well, the activation. Leaders and support units have no such activation level and are exempt from this rule. This is a little fuzzy. This one makes it very specific. It's only when you're integrating those leaders or support units in that there's no contamination. The force itself has the activation level, not the leader. and then they give some examples. These examples are useful because they might tell me something about the stacking restrictions. So I'm going to skim them and point anything out. A 3-star leader. Okay. You can't have 2 leaders at the same level. We knew that. Okay. In certain circumstances, certain situations, 2 forces will end up in the same hex without the need for either of them to be activated and able to spend movement points. We're assuming retreat or something like that. In these cases, the 2 forces must be consolidated into a single force through one of them being integrated and or absorbed by the other. The controlling players decide if there is a choice. Note that stacking limits will apply after accommodation as well, after consolidation as well. If the 2 forces consolidated into one had different activation levels, the new force gets the higher of them. Austrian retreats and ends its move in a hex with 2 allied Russian corps. The 2 different forces must be consolidated into one, and no unit can be absorbed, so the Austrian corps is integrated by the Russians. Right. But when checking stacking limits, the Russian realizes he has only one 2-star leader in the hex who can only command 4 steps. The Russian eliminates one of his own corps to settle the overstacking issue, but that's an issue of choice. Okay, army activations. Okay, that's we're at 16 pages, and some of them have been pretty light. Out of 50? About 50. 48, 47. About a third of the way. A little less. When an army commander is activated, he activates the... This is some of the weirdest stuff in the game, right? When an army commander is activated... Oh, but we're forgetting that the multiplayer rules are over there. When an army commander is activated, he activates the army marker he is stacked with and all its contents. He may also choose to activate any units and leaders adjacent to the army marker, integrating them into the army hex, subject to stacking and command rules. So it sucks everybody in. To stack an adjacent leader, the movement cost from the adjacent leader to the army hex must not be more than 2 movement points. Place the adjacent units into the army hex and compute the movement allowance of the army, reducing it with the spent movement points. So you spend to bring forces in. I would not assume that each adjacent force is going to... So let's say I have 2 adjacent forces to my army and I want to incorporate both of them. And let's say they're each 2 movement points to get into the army hex. I would not assume that costs 4 movement points. I would assume it's the largest of them. But it's not clear here. Like, reducing it with the spent movement points. It feels to me like each unit has spent the 2 movement points, so I shouldn't charge the whole army with 4 to coordinate. Although you could make an argument that, look, you're trying to pull together an army that's spread out all over hell and creation. So I don't know. But my reasoning is that it probably wouldn't cost twice as much. For example, a French force with Ney adjacent to Napoleon must cross a bridged hex. The cost is 2 movement points, so it's allowed, and the allowance of the army drops from 6 to 4. Such an action cannot be intercepted. The individual initiative values of units or leaders is irrelevant. Only the army commander counts. He's the one who's activating here. In terms of, are you allowed to activate? The total army size limit is applied to all units and leaders involved during the entire activation, including ones integrated or dropped off. If an army commander activates a force adjacent to the army marker, that force will receive the same activation level as the army, unless the adjacent force started the activation with a higher level. in which case the entire army receives a higher activation level. This all makes sense because you have to integrate. You have to suck the unit in. The Austrian Army of the Rhine is, with a first activation, it's activated. Its commander also activates an adjacent corps with none. The army of which the corps is now a part is raised to end of activation. Yeah. Now, end of activation implies that you will not get another chance to activate, that you only get two marches maximum. That other thing seems to be talking about events only. These rules apply at all times during the following operations: retreats, interception, combat avoidance, absorptions, integrations, landings, etc. Which rules? So this is 5.19. It is not subordinate to 5.18 or any of these other areas that we've gotten to. It's the activation system as a whole. This is not the case, right? You don't need a land marker to activate your force. I don't think that you're going to get an activation marker for retreating. Maybe I'm wrong. Reading this specifically, it would say that. A unit detached from an active force is considered to have the same level of activation as the force. If in the same hex only part of the force is activated and moves, the other units receive no activation level. Yes. And here they talk about the detachment case, which is not really a problem. The problem here is these rules. Which rules? Right? When these rules apply. Now, what's also weird is there are rules in here that are not about the application of the rules. So maybe it's only these rules are that a unit detached from an active force is the same activation, and I don't know, I really don't know. To me, this is like an absolute mess that fails to handle anything. Titling a rule, when these rules apply, it should apply to everything under 5.1. Everything. And that's obviously not the case. The question is it just these two subordinates, or is it something else? I don't know. We're going to figure it out as we go, right? Because things like integration apply during retreats and interceptions and whatnot. Lone units and detachments. A land activation may also activate a single combat unit. Guerrillas and Cossacks have their initiative value printed on their counter, 1 or 2. All other units have an intrinsic initiative of 1. The initiative value of the combat unit works like that of a leader. The unit can only be activated if its value is equal to or greater than the initiative marker drawn, so there's only one initiative in which you can move your infantry corps that are on their own. The activated combat unit cannot integrate any other units or leaders, but it can integrate itself into another force at the end of the move. Can it be absorbed? I assume so. It can also end its move with a leader, which will become the commander of the unit. It can absorb another combat unit. An activated unit abides by the same movement restrictions as a leader without a force. Yes, I believe it can also be absorbed by another unit, because there's the standard here. Let's see. A moving force can absorb another force or part of a force during movement or when it ends move. It can also absorb itself into another force when it ends its move. What's cool about that is you can march the unit forward at no cost and include its strength points into the strength points of another corps, a reduced corps. Cool or unbelievable. I mean, one of those two, right? It's faster than light travel. Yeah. An activated combat unit abides by the same movement restrictions as a leader without a force. What the fuck? That makes no sense. I think that's just false. Let's keep going. Exception. Like, a leader without a force doesn't get an activation marker, for example. Can move 8 hexes or 8 movement points. All kinds of interesting stuff. So no, if the unit is a guerrilla Cossack or a Turkish feudal corps, it has no such restrictions and can attack and lay siege freely if otherwise allowed. Okay, so here are the specific restrictions. It can't attack, it can't siege. That's the stuff it should be talking about. Okay, restrictions, whatever. But guerrillas, Cossacks, or Turkish feudal are able to do those things. Those are the units that have an initiative printed on them. A combat unit that is activated on its own has its activation level raised normally at the end of its move. Exception: a detachment that's activated on its own without a leader does not raise its activation level. Weird. But kind of in alignment with the absorption rules. A detachment really is only useful to be absorbed into core for the most part. I mean, yes, you could be using it as a half strength core or whatever, but right. Okay. And you can see these rules require a lot of combing and reflecting back on them. And this is part of the thing. When I first read it, I did all that. And this second reading, I don't feel like the fact that I've been away for so long is really the problem. I feel, oh, the camera's cleared up. The view screen's cleared up. It's like it has to warm up or something. What I feel is that that the rules are so bad that they didn't stick very well, and that I knew I was going to have to do this work again. But I think I would have had to do it no matter what. The only question is, how fresh would it be on my mind? But as I start to parse through it, I'm like, yeah, this is problematic. Okay, so I will go back and sit outside and read some of my Dean Attrition biography. Okay, and vision is still good. Yay. Events, so spring interphase is going to be an events, an economic, and budget phase, which is in the spring only. You would think being in the spring interphase that would be the case, but I'm not sure. And reinforcement and replacement phase. Okay. In the game turn itself, it handles diplomacy. Then you create an initiative pool, which is going to go at a cup. This is going to be a chit pull game where players get multiple chances to move their ground units and their naval units, but not in the initial scenario, from what I recall. Well, the first one I'm doing. Then activation phase, where you draw a chit, you do supply, rally, you move your units, either land or naval, depending on the chit you drew. You take attrition, and then you handle combat. Then there's a final attrition phase. You determine whether you've conquered things, and then you see if you automatically won the game. There's a more detailed sequence on the back of here, which again, event card draw, spring only in... Okay, so these two are spring only. So this is different. The events phase has, or the spring interphase has an events phase, 2 items. Okay, economic and budget is spring only. Reinforcement and replacement seems to happen at any point. So I think the spring interphase may not only happen in spring, because certain parts of it are listed spring only. This is a very, very truncated version of what's on the back of the playbook, and that's what we're going to use. We're going to use the back of the playbook a little bit more. But it gives you the broad idea. Okay, initiative pool. During the initiative phase, you put the initiative markers that will be used in the activation phase. These will be 4 land markers for both sides. Now note, it is possible for there to be more than... it is possible for there to be a neutral side as well. that gets to activate. The Empire Naval 1 and Coalition Naval 1 marker are both put in. Once per year, each side can add an additional naval marker into the pool. The neutral land marker and neutral naval markers are put in here. And then there's a winter quarter marker, which is not put in the pool during the summer turn. This is going to shorten the activation phase. During the other turns. Now, I find it kind of weird that winter, you'd go into, so ending the spring turn on the winter quarters makes sense because spring might have started late. I'm iffy about that both autumn and winter should have that, but let's see how this, we'll see what's going on with that. The effect of winter quarters is to immediately end the activation phase during winter turns. During autumn, you ignore the first time this marker is drawn and put it back in the pool after a playable activation marker is drawn. The second time it's drawn, the activation phase ends. Yeah, so the fall might be shorter than you think, but the winter also, you're able to fight during the winter, so it's not like you're fully going into quarters. During spring turns, ignore the first 2 times winter quarters is drawn and put it back into the pool. The third time, the activation phase ends, provided both the naval markers have been drawn. If not, I guess this is following on in this sentence, if not, a naval activation is performed by the side which has not played its naval marker. If both sides have not played theirs, the Empire plays its first. Yeah, this feels like it's part of this sentence, essentially. Really wonderful structuring. Once the pool is ready, the activation phase begins. During the first turn only, scenario special instructions may state which player activates first. This player can choose a marker from the initiative pool and begin the activation phase with it. The player can choose an enemy initiative marker to force his opponent to play first, but he can't choose winter quarters. Subsequently, the markers are randomly drawn by each side or each player in succession. In multiplayer games, the players should follow the diplomacy phase order. I don't know why you'd be drawing it in succession. It feels like both sides are in there along with the neutrals, and you just use whoever goes. Limitation. The same side cannot be activated twice in a row with a land marker. Ignore neutral and naval markers for this rule. Okay, that's really weirdly stated. I think if I do a land activation, any neutral and naval markers are just discarded. Are activated, whatever. But I can't have 2 land activations in a row, even if there are intervening. I think that's what they mean. Let's look. Coalition land marker is drawn and some leaders are activated. If the next drawn marker is also coalition land, it's put back in the initiative and the process continues. So players are going to alternate, in fact. A sequence, coalition land, neutral, coalition land, is not allowed. An Empire land must be drawn prior to the second coalition marker. So yeah, we're going to have some confusing stuff here. On the other hand, a sequence of coalition naval, neutral, and coalition land is allowed. Yeah. So we're going to have this weird situation where we have to withdraw. Like if somebody gets 2 land activations in a row, we're going to have to kind of keep track of that. Which means we're not going to be able to use the cup in the way that like we'd really like, which is to be able to wander away after a chit pull. We're going to have to keep track of who got the last activation, and if they have a stack of, chits that have to go back and all kind of stuff. We'll see how we can work it, but it's going to be painful. If a side draws a playable land marker but activates no leaders, the next activated side will nevertheless be the opposite side. Okay, I didn't need to know that. During subsequent turns, the first marker is randomly drawn. However, the first marker drawn cannot be winter quarters. If it's drawn, it's set aside and will be put back as soon as an activation marker is drawn. A land activation marker for the side which had the last activation during the previous turn. This is going to be painful. So we have to keep track of who had the last land activation of the prior turn. This is a really big game to have that kind of state carrying over, you know, again and again. So we're going to have to remember to deal with that. Stacking. There can only be one force in a hex. A force is one of the following: either a combat unit with 1 or 2 steps without a leader, a single-star leader who has 2 steps, a 2-star leader with 4 steps, or a 3-star or 4-star leader with 6 steps and a subordinate leader. I don't think the subordinate leader is necessary. An army, as explained in the glossary, the size of which varies according to the leader's command capacity, plus 4 subordinate leaders. Again, I don't think the 4 subordinate leaders are necessary. Let's take a look at army here. An army comprises a commander, an army marker, and at least 1 corps. It may contain up to 4 subordinate leaders, additional corps, and any number of support units. A stack adjacent to an army marker may temporarily be part of the army. An army can only have the total size and combat steps equal to the command capacity of the commander. I think adjacent units, you define them as part of the army for movement purposes, but we should have to. We're going to have to see how this is all handled. What are we at here? It could hold 2 armies or 3 armies. If a leader on his reverse side and an army marker are present, the player can assign to the army a number of steps equal to the leader's command capacity. A lower ranked leader cannot command a leader with a higher rank. These rules are not cumulative. If an army stops, please note that simply moving through a hex without stopping is allowed. In a hex with a detachment, the detachment must be absorbed and the proper number of movement points spent, and its steps must be absorbed into the units assigned to the army. If there is not enough room, or if the player does not want or cannot spend the required movement points, the excess steps are eliminated. So if you can't absorb the detachment, you kill it. If a leader was stacked with these eliminated steps, he's put back in the leader pool. The same would apply to a corps exceeding the stacking limits. If an army, corps of different major powers can be in an army, corps of different major powers can be stacked together if they belong to allied powers. Cool. The number of allied steps must be less than, but not equal to, half the number of steps of the same nationality as the army counter, though. This limit does not apply to forces other than armies. For example, 1 Russian 3-star leader can command 2 Russian steps and 4 Prussian steps. And control 6, yes. With a Prussian 2-star leader. Why is the 2-star leader necessary? I don't know if he is. So you can have a subordinate leader in this stack, or maybe you must, and I guess it's kind of implying that you have to have a leader who can command the other forces in the stack. But again, this is not at all clear to me, right? Like this just appears to be an example, not a rule. So maybe the Russian leader could command those 4 Prussian steps without a Prussian 2-star leader. I mean, it's really weird. It's like, yeah. A Cossack can stack with another Cossack if a cavalry leader is present, or with a Russian cavalry corps. Is that only 1 Cossack can do that in a hex? Or no, they can't be part of an army, so yeah. Any number of supply units and engineers can freely stack with within a force. 3 fleets of the same side can stack together in a sea area, blockade box, or a harbor, which doesn't seem like a lot. And I think I've cheated, because I think I have 4 fleets here, which is problematic. Ruh-roh. Okay. I think it's only that one case. And that's my fault, not the rules. So this is the first coalition. The Brits had in any British port, which seems singular, 4 fleets. I don't know what the 0, oh, that's a land leader. That's why. All right, we'll put that one off on his own. And where will we put him? We should put him in Scapa Flow. I think I'll put him in London. Is London a port? London is not a port. Yarmouth is a port. That doesn't seem like a good idea. All right, we'll put them up in Hull. Okay. I don't think the Spaniards had, I think they were required to put like 1 per port or something like that. I think we're okay. Okay. Pawing through to make sure I haven't cheated. How far are we here? All right, let's make it through this section. All right, which leader takes precedence for movement in combat? A leader with the most stars commands all troops in the hex. If 2 leaders have the same number of stars, the owning player decides which leader is the overall commander, and the others must go back to the leader pool. A sovereign outranks all other leaders. Army command in an army with allied nationalities. In an army with several nationalities, the army commander is the senior leader among the leaders from the major power indicated by the army marker. If there's no army marker, the senior leader commands the force. In case of ties, the owning player chooses. This is weird because if there's no army commander, if there's no army marker, there's no army command, I think. If one of the leaders belongs to an allied minor power and both leaders are of the same rank, command is given to the major power leader. Now here we have an example again, which might just confuse us. For example, a Russian 2-star leader and a Swedish 2-star leader form a force. Command is given to the Russian leader, and the Swedish leader returns to the leader pool. If the Russian leader was a 3-star leader, the Swedish leader could have stayed in the stack. Units from allied minor powers can be commanded by a leader from the controlling major power. Okay. But it seems like units from allied major powers like it feels like units can be commanded by multinational forces. But I'm not sure of that, because that weird example back here about 4 Prussian steps with a Prussian 2-star leader. Now, this would allow the Russian-Swedish combination, because that's an allied minor, perhaps. So I don't know. Command of a hex with allied armies. If several allied armies are in the same hex, the leader commanding the army with the most steps will be the overall commander. regardless of rank, I guess. If tied, the players should agree which leader will be the overall commander. If the players cannot reach an agreement, the overall commander will be decided by the highest rank power in diplomacy phase order, which I believe is fixed. And we can look here. Nope. Thought it would be there. Okay. Oh well. Replacing commanders. Once a leader has become a commander of a force, he can lose that command only in these cases. If a leader with or without units arrives in a hex, it may take over command of the force. Okay. Replaced or dismissed leaders are put back in the leader pool, except if they can stack with the new commander. For a core level force, may be taken over by a leader by the same or higher rank than the previous commander. For an army, the leader must be higher ranked to take over command. And then the example actually looks perfectly fine. After defeat in battle, if a force has been defeated in a major or minor battle, its commander may be immediately dismissed and returns to the leader pool. Exception, a sovereign can be dismissed only after a defeat in a major battle. The controlling player chooses a replacement from the leader pool. So you're able to sack people after a loss with an army. The player controlling chooses, and it says chooses, so again, I feel like you could have the capability to put new leaders in place. But it's kind of strange because you get to choose your leaders to a large extent. Why you would dismiss someone, well, it's only if they suck, right? Dropping off a commander's force. If an maybe if their army is so weak that you want to put somebody who's less important in charge. I don't know. If an activated leader leaves his force, either in part or as a whole, the left alone units must obey stacking limits or the move is prohibited. An army leader, though, can never leave his army, only drop off pieces of it or whatever. Voluntary dismissal of leaders. Any leader may be voluntarily dismissed by its controlling player, including an army commander. Such dismissal occurs in the leader deployment step of the economy phase, which is in the spring interphase, which is not only in spring, from what I can tell. Well, no, the economy phase is only in spring. But I'm not sure all of the spring interphase is only in spring. A dismissed leader is removed from the map and placed into the leader pool. Players should remove all leaders they wish to dismiss first. They then choose a replacement from the leader pool for each dismissed leader. The chosen leader cannot be the dismissed leader. The new leader sets up stacked with the force. Well, I think this is goofy from my reading of it, because if you choose to replace a leader with the dismissed leader, since you just chose to remove the leader, you just didn't choose to. So, you could pull all your leaders to give you freedom. If an army commander is dismissed, the same procedure as above applies, except the new army commander must be chosen among the leaders belonging to the army, including the new chosen leader, according to the rank rules described above. So you remove a leader and you put a new leader in, but that new leader may not be the highest ranked, so he wouldn't command the army, is I guess. Again, there's this, they then choose. I don't know if choose is defined here. I highly doubt it. H comes before O, so I think not. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think all your command are free choice. Like, you get to look and pick, right? This is somewhat problematic, but the wording, I don't know. I would gripe if it said randomly choose. So I think it's all decisive. You make your own choice. You make your informed choice out of the leaders. You don't pick randomly or anything. If an army commander is dismissed, yeah, okay. Activating subordinate leaders within an army. Within an army, it's possible to activate subordinate leaders to command units from the army without activating the army itself, providing limits on nationality are applied, i.e. you can break off a unit, essentially. Leaders moving alone. Leaders can voluntarily leave their units while moving, but they cannot pick up units with or without leaders if moving alone. They may end their move with other forces and take command of them. Naval Squadron Command. For naval units, the French and British admirals are automatically overall commanders. Between admirals with the same nationality, the overall commander is the admiral with the best maneuver factor. If still tied, the player chooses. Doesn't say what to do if they're different nationalities. Say Spain and Russia, who both have navies, have their admirals together. Admirals cannot be dismissed, yeah, because they're your troops. All right, we're going to pause there. Again, this is going to be a struggle to work through, in part because it's been so long since I read it. Okay, back up here after another grueling day of trying to cope with issues of life, which I did manage to handle, I think, and going to give another try in the near future. But yeah, the funny thing is, whatever positive comes from solving a problem is just nothing like the negative from not being able to cope with it. That freezes me so completely. I don't feel energized or anything. I just feel exhausted, which is the usual after anything positive happens. Anyway, armies. Okay, so each of the nations has some army boxes. You can see the counters in them. They look kind of like that. They have the name for the army. They have a couple of artillery points on their front side, except for the Grand Army, which has 3. And this will be added to any core artillery values. Remember, the artillery value is kind of weird. It's like in the middle of some of the counters. Some of them have something else there. The maximum size of an army depends on its commander's capacity. The maximum number of steps is printed on the reverse side of the leader's counter. Yeah. Let's look at an infantry leader, or well, he is. Okay, so this says 3x0 on the top of it, and doesn't have a step number, but maybe it's that 3. We didn't get leaders yet. Over here. Let's take a look and see. Yeah. Again, this horrible thing that I try to figure out what the fuck they're talking about, right? Rank is the stars. Army command capacity is apparently the middle number. And on the back, where it says I should have it, well, yes, that's where it is, in the center and the back. Do I have an army leader? This guy might be. And there you go. He has a command capacity of 12 steps. I guess it's important to say that steps, so like a corps has 2 steps in it, unless it's reduced. The corps belonging to and in the same hex as the army marker are placed in the corresponding boxes on the side of the map. And they simulate fog of war, so I'm assuming you can't paw through them. And the glow is gone. It's like so weird. It was there just a moment ago. This is just something to do with my side of things. Nobody's getting this problem. Only the army marker, supply units, and the commanding officer are placed on the map. Each army can have up to 4 leaders subordinate to the army commander. Corps in the same hex as the Army counter and corps in hexes adjacent to it may belong to the Army. There's no real way to determine, well, we'll get to that later, but it's like there's no mechanical system that I'm aware of for showing that something's part of an Army or it's not. You know, if it's in the box, it's in the box, but if it's in the hex next to the Army, yeah. And then they say only the Army market, the supply units, and the commanding officer are placed on the map, but the Army can include things that aren't in its hex. I don't know. The Army marker can stay on the map as long as at least one Army corps is part of the Army. Failing that, the Army marker is removed as soon as no corps remain in the Army and it's put in the pool. If not demoralized, an Army exerts a zone of influence on the 6 hexes around it. Now, remember, corps and hexes adjacent to the Army counter. Now, what it doesn't say is that detachments can too. Again, these rules are very, very questionable. If not demoralized, an Army exerts a zone of influence on the 6 hexes around it, even if occupied by an enemy unit or an unbesieged enemy fortress. This zone of influence cuts supply lines and hinders combat avoidance. Retreats into a zone of influence are penalized as well. The Army marker can increase the stacking capacity in a hex. It allows subordinate units to use the Army commander's ratings, and it increases the possibility of marching to the sound of guns, etc. What? An Army engaged, I mean, if you want to list the things that it does, don't put an etc. at the end of one of the bullet points. You know, there may be other, you may put another bullet point that says there's other things, but it's like, yeah, we didn't want to list them all. Or maybe that etc. is meant to be other things that have the same effect as marching to the sound of guns, but, you know, they're not actually in the roles. I don't know. An Army engaged in battle does not exert a zone of influence. A little bit of a typo here where they didn't bold everything. Again, that might have been introduced later, but yeah, that's the kind of typo that you'd expect to be caught in the second printing. Army markers are considered to have an intrinsic and permanent engineering unit, which we'll get to. You don't have to have the counter, though, for it. An Army engaged in battle does not... we already talked about that. There are 2 types of support units, engineers and supply. Engineers are on the other side of bridges, yeah. Engineers have no combat modifier, but they do have a siege modifier of +1. Now, you'll see there's black writing there. I don't know if you can see that. I can almost see it through the camera. I can see that there's something there without the camera. But there's a 6 for 6 movement. There's a 1 there, which I guess is the siege +1, and a movement factor. They're eliminated if an enemy unit enters their hex without spending any points, or if all combat units stacked with them are destroyed. They give bonuses in siege unless out of supply. They also give benefits for crossing rivers. On the other side, there's a pontoon bridge to show this capacity, and that also has something black on it. I think it's an X. It's an X to indicate the bridge cannot move on its own, which makes sense. Supply units. These units have 2 sides. One side is the mobile side of the supply train. The other side is a static depot. The trains have no combat values or destroyed, etc., same as engineers. Depots have a half point of combat, half-point combat point. I don't know what that means, right? Like, I don't think it's a combat modifier. I think it's a half a strength point, but we're not sure. Do we have combat points described here with combat units? We do not. We have a combat modifier. So I think it's like, oh, here we go. Each step is worth 1 combat points except depots, which are worth a half point per step. There we go. All right. depots are also eliminated. They do not count against the leader's command capacity, nor for the number of steps in a hex during attrition. They can be used to reactivate a fortress, and I think that expends them. Guerrillas. They have an initiative of 1. Initiative is not something that units have, but it is something leaders have. And it's usually the first number on a leader. It looks like guerrillas are somewhere between a leader, but I don't know. See, on a guerrilla, we have a +1, a 4 movement rate. The +1 is black, which is the combat modifier, which is available only in difficult terrain, mountain passes, and mountains, and it's in brown as a reminder. Really, again, this could be red, right? It would show up on most of the counters if it was red. Maybe not the red ones. And a movement factor of 4. They have a morale factor of 1, which I guess is this number here because that aligns with morale, and the combat factor aligns. So everything kind of works on the guerrillas, except that initiative, which is, it's the white number here. But yeah, we have to decipher things pretty heavily because there's no graphic representation, much as those are pretty crowded and not very helpful. You know, very painful to use is what I mean. They're helpful. Guerrillas cannot be part of an army. They can't stack with any other units, including other guerrillas. We have Cossacks. They have an initiative of 2. Okay, so that's this here. The Y indicates they count as cav. Combat modifier that only applies in winter, written in light blue as a reminder, and a morale of 2. They have a movement factor of 8, which is printed in black so you can't see it. And they can move and fight without a leader. Hence, they have an initiative. When a Russian cavalry leader is present, 2 Cossack units can stack together, or 1 Cossack and a Cav Corps. Cossack units can never be part of armies except when stacked with a cavalry corps with a Cav leader present. Okay. That's really sort of a restrictive guide there, but like I feel like, yeah, if the Cav unit takes a hit, then maybe the Cossack can't be there anymore, and I don't know. We'll see. Land units are the most important combat counters for a land strategy. They're required to move corps and detachments as well as to land leaders, as well as to lead armies. A leader can command a number of steps depending on his rank. Not defined here, but quite a bit later. A Cav leader can command a Cossack unit for free in addition to his Cav Corps, or he can command 2 Cossack units if he has no corps under his command. Now, Cav leaders still have a rank, and some, like Marat, have an army command capacity. We shall keep seeing. On their front side, which is the corps leader side, they have the following values. An initiative, this is the value defines the leader's capacity to move during the activation phase and to perform interceptions and combat avoidance. The higher the number, the better. Combat modifiers, this is the leader's die roll bonus when resolving combat, and the number of available combat tactics, which are the cards. And I think they're an option. When the modifier is colored, the leader can play 2 combat tactics instead of just 1. God, this is going to be hard to remember all of this. Combat modifier, where is that written? Okay, it's the final number over there. So Marat ends up with no combat modifier as an army leader. This guy stays as a corps leader regardless of side. I don't think there's a difference between the 2 sides. Except like for some reason, that's to indicate that he's been activated. Yeah, you flip him over after he's been activated. But army leaders don't get that. I don't know if the army gets flipped over. Let's take a look at an army. Yep, the army records that piece of information for an army leader. Now, a corps leader who is also an army commander, I don't know how you report that. Right? I guess you flip him over and he doesn't have an army. Don't know. Okay. Rank is 1 to 3 stars, which represents the leader within the hierarchy. However, sovereigns have a 4th star, which is white to identify them. It's gold on the normal, and a rank above all other leaders. Some leaders have the cav symbol, which is not a Y, it's crossed sabers. Yeah, I'll believe it. Which means they have capabilities for specific to cavalry. But it doesn't seem to at all negate their capabilities otherwise. Entry date, this is the year during which the leader appears in a pool of available leaders during the spring turn. If a second year is listed on the counter, this is an exit date, and it means it cannot be used for scenarios starting after this year. And then for ease of reference, entry and exit dates in red are in pre-1805, white are available in both revolutionary and non, and blue coded dates are invisible so that you can't make them out. On the reverse side, an army leader has his ratings as an army commander. For others, their name is highlighted in white, showing they've been activated. Okay, does cover that. Army commanders have the same capacities as corps commanders, plus a value, giving the number of steps the army under their command may contain. This is their command capacity. Now, I think this is 16. It's kind of hard to tell, like, because the black line is covering part of the 1 there, so I don't know if that's an offset 1 to mean something else, but I don't think so. Leaders have 8 movement points if they're not stacked with combat units in a hex entered by enemy combat units. The leader is immediately placed into the leader pool. A leader may remain on the map or be placed in the pool when he has no remaining combat units, or during his activation if alone in a hex. 4 Turkish leaders are known only by their titles, which are shown with their names in parentheses and without a portrait. They function as normal leaders in all respects. Some of the leaders will not have a portrait. Again, there was no portrait available for them. And then there's things like this. So we'll see here the fleet is in parentheses here, which is similar to that, which may be, again, an unnamed leader rather than the brackets that were talked about that I couldn't find. Did we have brackets? I don't remember what was up with brackets. Was that on land units? I remember something about brackets, but now I can't find it. Uh-oh. It was yesterday. And it was under an exception. Back here? No. Yeah, I don't know where that is. I hope we run into it again. I mean, maybe I saw it somewhere else, right? Because this looks like what I pointed out when I was talking about the brackets. Naval units, fleets. These are represented by fleet counters with either a geographical area. This is just the historical name of the fleet, not necessarily a restriction on their area of operations, or the name of the admiral who commands it. So, unlike land units, there's no difference between fleets and its admiral. One counter represents both. And this is very weird because your commander goes down with the ship, and I don't think you can rebuild those fleets, but let's keep looking. The fleet counter's front side gives the fleet or admiral's name, the maneuver factor, combat factor, and entry date. Just like with land leaders, if the admiral has a second date, it cannot be used in a scenario starting after this. The fleet's counter on the reverse side gives its movement factor in black again, so as not to be confusing. Now, what is in the middle here? Nothing. Okay? And we see the values here. Name, portrait, fleet name, maneuver factor, which is this number here, which I think is kind of like the initiative thing. I think it's your chance of like intercepting and stuff like that. The actual movement factor is on the back, which is going to be the same, I think, for all fleets. And then it's a naval unit because it has blue in an anchor or blue there. Enemy intelligence, it's forbidden to look at the contents of an enemy stack except during combat phases. Only the leader of the stack is visible. The production of any player can be examined by any other player. Don't know what that means, right? Like, does that mean the force pool? Or does that mean it sounds like what they're actually producing, which you're not going to be able to examine that for long. All right. Yeah, this is going to take fucking forever because I am really struggling with many things. Let's go over the sequence of play. I'll swap batteries first. So this is the ones I remembered, and they also have parentheses instead of brackets. What I think... So what's kind of weird there is that fleets are named after their admiral. Now those don't have an admiral's name on them. Things like Serenissima and Baltic or whatever. So I think they're peculiar fleets to certain minor nations. There may be some that are also for the major nations. I know that there are things that do not come in right away. Like I said, some units. Again, also leaders, I think, are sort of units as well, if I recall correctly. Like they have their own core with them. Okay. Combat units. These are corps or detachments. So now here they don't say leaders count as troops, so maybe I'm wrong about that. One unit is an army corps or a detachment. Detachments can be created by leaders commanding a corps or an army, or during reinforcements. And a combat unit is a unit with at least one strength point. The units will have the class, the identity. The identity is kind of annoying. It's written as a number in the center of the piece, and in some cases this is really hard to distinguish what's number, what's flag, what the fuck's going on. I see some that have like a circle in the middle or something. I don't know what the hell. I might just be misreading a 2 in with the visual of the flag that's behind it. I find the graphics in this game to be horrendous. That's no big shock. Compass is often really, really bad at the graphic arts. The unit's combat modifier, which will be the +2 here, that could also be a negative number or a 0 or whatever. That +2 is very, very good. The artillery value, which we follow these lines. Again, their graphics in the rulebook are kind of iffy too. You can barely see this black line with naked eyes. You can see it here. That's going to be the artillery capabilities for that. And then the unit morale, which is the final number in the value. Here are the different types of combat units spelled out. This is kind of odd because we have, for example, Austrian Reserve. I mentioned this in the setup blows. I think it counts as infantry because the only thing with that value for the scenario was of that type. So I don't know. Corps usually have 2 steps. You flip them over to get to the other step. Each step is worth 1 combat point, except depots, which are half. When stacked alone, I think that's for losses. Some units have only 1 step, for example, detachments. Otherwise, the front side is the 2-side unit. The reverse is the single step. The 2-step side is of the unit is also indicated through the use of white dots separating its value. The 1-step side has red dots. Okay, so there are apparently some little tiny red dots there that I didn't know about. And if we look at one of these, we see some little dashes, or that I assume are the dots there. Those little red dots were not visible to me. I don't know if they matter too much. And again, on the back of a unit, yeah, you'll see the barely visible, you know, I mean, again, this is like looking under a magnifying glass when I do that, okay? That is how you can see things in this game in many cases. And you can kind of read the the black print on the very dark blue for the 1805 plus scenarios. The movement factor of most units is 6 movement points per activation, except for leaders, Cossacks, and cavalry units under a cav leader's command, which is 8, and guerrillas is 4. Where there's room on a given counter, the movement factor is listed as a reminder, distinguishable by black text. Yeah? I wonder where that happens. See, those are leaders. Yeah, I really, maybe we zoom in and see, is there some little number here? I don't see an example of this. I don't know where there's room. They certainly could have printed a tiny little invisible number on these. We'll see if I ever notice one. Now, maybe there are some special cases. Where am I? Oh, strangely, there are no Spanish guerrillas. This guy has, I think, a date on him. Or else a hex. 93 to 97, yeah. Those are brought in by cards. They're close to guerrillas. Where were my guerrillas? I swear I had guerrillas that I had seen. But I don't remember. I would expect them to be among the Spaniards. But I don't see any. So that's kind of odd. And I don't remember where else guerrillas were. Okay. Well, we'll try to keep that in mind. Guerrillas would be something I would expect to have the number on. Cossacks would be another. Let's see if we can... Here's some Russians. Cossacks have a big white 2 on them. That obviously is not what we were looking for. They have an 8 there in the place of where the artillery number would be. In black, I think that's what they mean. I think that's what they mean. That they replace the artillery number. See, this is really weird, right? The way it's worked. Where there is room on a given counter, the movement factor is listed as a reminder distinguished by black text. It's black text on there. It's in the location where the artillery would be, which is not at all what I would expect. I would expect a tiny number somewhere. Probably not in black text because that would be unreadable on a lot of the counters. But, you know, again, their design functionality is so weak. All right. This is going to take me forever to get through. But I don't feel like being up here any longer. So we're going to plug this in and let it recharge a little bit. All right. Well, I'm supposed to hold the box up here. Nation in Arms, Compass Games. Say one good thing about the Compass. The edition I ordered from them, well, the copy I ordered from them, came and somehow, I don't know, in shipping or whatever, or maybe pre-shipping, the box had been damaged. I sent a message out, and you deal directly with the owner of the company with any customer complaints of that sort. And he sent me a spare box. I've had a couple of issues with Compass Games One didn't even arrive. I don't know if it got porch theft or whatever. They replaced that as well. So, you know, a lot of kudos there. However, this is a game that had my eye. You know, any grand strategic Napoleonic era game is going to catch some of my attention, but I read horror stories about it. It was particularly interesting to me because it says the Wars of Napoleon Bonaparte, 1792 to 1815. I thought there would be a grand campaign scenario. There is not. Probably for similar reasons that there's no grand campaign for, what the hell is it? The Empires in Arms game, which came up with a revolutionary scenario as well. So we're going to be playing the revolutionary scenario first, and then we'll give a try to the big 1805 campaign. We may squeeze in, there's a Napoleon in Italy one, and there's a 1799 short game as well, which is when the Russians enter in 1799. Anyway, that was one of the big disappointments was when I read the rules and realized, wow, this isn't going to be what I hoped for. I hoped for something that would handle the revolutionary edging into and, you know, allowing for the invasion of Egypt and everything. And it would, however, trying to make it a viable strategy and everything just doesn't generally work in a Napoleonic game. Okay, on from that. This is going to hold a whole bunch of players. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4. I guess 7. Same as Empires in Arms, same player choices, sure. Yeah, and I'm not sure if this first scenario actually, in fact, I'm pretty sure it doesn't actually handle more than 2 players. Let's take a look at some of the components. Obviously, you have the map here, which looks fine. I see nothing, you know, which really disturbs me. It's got kind of a cartoony quality to it, but okay. There's the counters themselves, which are a little weird. So individual core are covered in this game using things like this. And some of them will have a date on them for when they enter the force pool. In addition, leaders are present with the date that they come in. Now, this is one of the big negatives here. This is actually their entry date and exit date. Now, the exit date is only actually important if you're starting a scenario after that exit date. Then they won't be in the counter mix. If they're within the appropriate range, so they don't like leave the map on that date, is what I'm saying. They don't auto die or anything like that. There might be some exceptions from cards, but whatever. Because I notice the sultans are in there, and they could conceivably cause some issue like that. But the problem here has to do with the dark blue, which is everything that exists in 1805 and after. The color on these, and I've gone over this in my setup woes already. The red, which are readable, are revolutionary only. The white span the revolutionary and the regular Napoleonic Wars, so they could be used in both periods. The dark blue is the main era of the Napoleonic Wars, 1805 onward, and unfortunately I find them unreadable. I think they would have always been unreadable. So anyway, there's this weirdness of there being individual core markers as opposed to strength point markers, which I'm more comfortable with from, say, War and Peace, Empires and Arms, and other games. I don't really feel that the core are terribly intuitive to me in the same sort of way. It's not like individual units that are going to have, you know, particularly differentiated values, but there are a few that are a little bit better and a few that may be a little bit worse in each case. You have decks of cards. There's two different decks. I think the tactical cards here are an option, and they're used for resolving battles. And then there's more straightforward event cards. This is not a CDG. It's a game with political events in it that players actually, in some cases, start the scenario with. You have a rulebook and then a playbook. There is one weirdness, you know, from what you're normally used to in a playbook, right? There would be scenarios, examples of play. You've got that stuff in here. Not too much in the way of examples of play, mainly going into the very core military mechanisms rather than some of the rest of the stuff. But also, this sucker contains, the playbook thing, contains the multiplayer roles. The game is basically designed as a two-player game. With, you know, diplomatic actions happening on a chart, etc. I'm going to be playing it 7-player. Certainly when I get to the 1805 scenario, I don't think it works in the 1792 scenario. One thing of note in the rulebook is, for the second printing, we decided to provide updated rule and playbook, which included errata and clarifications of the last years of play. It's not a second edition, supposedly, but they made modifications, which is, yeah, it is a second edition then. Second and revised. I decided to add a revised version of the first coalition scenario and a new introductory scenario of Bonaparte in Italy. Find, as a bonus, you'll find an alternative activation system for those who want less chaos. Okay. I'm not really too worried about that. But what I am worried about is these rules are still kind of a mess. And I found at least one person stating that they didn't incorporate all of the errata that was in play up at the time of printing. That person rewrote the rules. I don't feel like printing that out, but I may use it as a reference. It's someone who really loves the game, but hates the rulebook. Okay. In addition, you have a number of play aids here. Let's take a look at some of these. Some information there. Various tables that we need. This has to do with the number of commanders. Maximum number of strength points, I'm guessing. I don't know what CU is. For the different scenarios, reminders for certain rules, a terrain effects chart, great. And then trade to handle blockade and trading with England, etc. Production costs for different units and what you can spend on. What each minor power has, I guess. And diplomacy that the various nations have. Okay. Mainly for dealing with minors, but remember, as a two-player game, in a sense, it's going to be in England versus France, so like the nominally major powers are going to be minors. Right. What else was I going to say? I don't know. It's been about a month, maybe two. Yeah, probably about 2 months since I read the rules, which means they're really, really foggy in my head. Now, we're going to go through them again, and that'll serve as a reminder for me, as well as a means of getting information as to how the game goes. To whatever extent we can. Some intro type stuff here. The game each year has 4 turns by season. During spring, budgeting will happen. Weather will be handled via attrition and early end of activation phases. Tell us what we have. Charts and tables take precedence if there's any difference. Great. Got a glossary of some terms. We're going to have to worry about some of these, but again, my understanding is that the rulebook isn't all that good at holding to keeping all these terms. For example, eliminated versus destroyed. There is no definition for destroyed, but they use destroyed in place of eliminated, was one complaint that I saw from the particular person. We have a number of different nations. The 1792 borders have also been highlighted on the map as the uniform colors of their respective nations. Not a big deal. The Polish partition hasn't taken place yet. Minor countries that in 1805 became part of French national territory are labeled. So we should see some things like here, Geneva, French in 1805, and GE. I don't know what GE is. Part of Germany? Not clear. Leader name appears in brackets. I don't know what they're talking about here. If a unit or leader name appears in brackets, that counter is not generally available in the initial force pools. It enters play as reinforcements or through special effects, or is optional. I think we have some units on the board. I haven't actually worried about this. I don't know if I saw any, but I think in some of the minors, we had some bracketed stuff here, in particular with the navies. Okay, here I have parentheses. That sounds almost like brackets. Let me paw through and see if I see another example.